representatives. Now, dear Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor羽場. Thank you for arranging this talk. And ladies and gentlemen that are listening, it's a privilege to be with you. I look forward to the chance to exchange ideas and to explain to you my perspective on what is happening in the world today and what is the correct approach to diplomacy and peacemaking. This is very relevant for Japan because Japan is, of course, not only one of the world's most important leading countries, but faces many questions about the role of the United States, the role of China, the role of Russia, and the path to security. My main message is that security can be achieved only through diplomacy, not through great power, politics, or confrontation. The idea of security through a military buildup in Japan, to my mind, is a mistake. What I believe to be important in East Asia, as in the other crises that I will discuss, is diplomacy. I see no barrier to peaceful cooperation between China, Japan, Korea, and the other countries of the Asia-Pacific region. So I do not believe that the issue is Japan's security against China, for example. I believe that China and Japan can get along peacefully, as they have done through most of their history over the last 2,000 years. The record is largely one of peace, and the question is how to ensure peace looking forward. And I believe that U.S. military bases and military approaches are not the answer to that, but diplomacy, shared values, shared objectives are the answer. So I've been kindly asked by Professor羽場to speak about three different global crises, the one in Ukraine, the one in the Middle East, and the one in East Asia. And you'll see from my remarks that I believe they have a common root. And the common root is great power politics, especially U.S. politics, because the United States has been the dominant country in the world since 1945. And I believe that it has misused its dominance by focusing on military rather than diplomatic approaches, and that it's because of the failure of diplomacy that we have these tensions, including these conflicts. I have been personally involved in all three regions for more than 40 years. My first trip to Ukraine and to Russia was 55 years ago in 1970. After that, I served as an economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev and to President Boris Yeltsin 35 years ago. I served as an economic advisor to the president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, 30 years ago. So my experience is firsthand. My first trip to Israel was 53 years ago. I have been going to the Middle East for more than 50 years. And I believe that I understand a lot about that conflict as well. My first trip to Japan was 45 years ago, and I have had the great privilege to be coming to Japan for more than 45 years. And I'm a great admirer of Japan, and with many, many students and many colleagues in Japan over more than 4 decades. I have been going to China also for 44 years, since 1981. I come to Japan and to China usually at least once a year, but often many times a year, and also to Korea. So I believe that I have some firsthand knowledge of your wonderful region of the world, and I want to share my perspective on your region as well. Let me start back in 1945, at the end of World War II. At that point, the United States was the dominant country in the world. It was the only major economy in the world that had not been damaged or destroyed by the Second World War. So the United States was by far the technological leader of the world, and it was the industrial and military leader of the world. And for that reason, it created a great deal of the post-war world. Well, Japan knows the story well because Japan was occupied by the United States for several years after 1945, and the United States helped Japan to rebuild after World War II. It was already in 1945, but especially by 1947, that the United States decided that the Soviet Union was the new enemy, and that even though the US and the Soviet Union had been allies in World War II against the German-Japanese axis, the two allies broke apart soon after the end of World War II and entered, of course, into the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States was the dominant economy and the technological leader on most areas, but the Soviet Union was a very formidable country and a formidable military country, and the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was very aggressive, especially in nuclear armaments, and both sides built up tens of thousands of nuclear weapons during this period. There were moments when the Russian or Soviet side was clearly ahead, the most notable being 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, when Soviet space technology was ahead of the United States space technology, and the Soviet Union succeeded in putting a satellite into orbit for the first time. And this, of course, led to the space race and the race to the moon, and also to the race of militarizing space. The point, however, is that the period from 1945 to 1989 was a period of confrontation, and a very dangerous period of confrontation. In my opinion, which I won't elaborate because it would take us a little bit far afield, I believe that the United States was not interested in ending the Cold War, but rather in winning the Cold War. There were times when the Soviet Union proposed a solution to end the Cold War, the most important of which was the demilitarization of Germany and turning Germany into a neutral country rather than into a NATO country. The United States rejected that approach. The United States was against the neutrality of Germany and favored the rearmament of Germany as the major military power in Europe to fight with the Soviet Union if the Cold War turned into a hot war. So the United States did not pursue one avenue to end the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s, which was the demilitarization of Germany. Rather, the United States established NATO, and the idea of NATO was to build up a formidable military alliance that would confront the Soviet Union. And that is how the Cold War proceeded. Of course, during the Cold War, there were moments when the Cold War almost became a global nuclear war. And the most notable was October 1962, when the Soviet Union put in military bases and offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba. And this led to confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union, and very, very nearly to nuclear war. It was only because President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev were more careful than their aides and their advisors that we did not end the world in October 1962. The two leaders found a way to resolve the crisis peacefully without war, but it was a very close call. Now, in 1989, the Soviet Union was by then in economic crisis, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which had been under the Soviet control, wanted their independence. And I participated in that process personally as a leading economic advisor to governments that aimed to escape from the Soviet system and to rejoin the European Union market economy. I can tell you at that period, the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, favored those changes. It was very remarkable. He actually helped to bring about the democratization of Central and Eastern Europe because he was a man of peace, and he wanted to end the Cold War peacefully, and he wanted reform truly, and he wanted democratization truly. It was the great opportunity of our time. I saw it firsthand. I recommended at that time that the United States help the Soviet Union to make reforms. My ideas were rejected by the US government. They said, why should we help our enemy? And I said, because the Soviet Union is not your enemy. The Soviet Union is trying to make changes. But the United States thinks in terms of friends and enemies. It cannot think in any other way. As an imperial power, the United States has its friends and it has its enemies. And the Soviet Union was an enemy, and the leadership of the United States was not flexible enough in its thinking to understand that the Soviet Union was no longer an enemy. So the United States government rejected my advice to give help to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev fell from power in 1991, and the Soviet Union ended in December 1991. I was in the Kremlin the day that happened, speaking with President Boris Yeltsin, and I assured him that the United States would help Russia to make its economic and political transformation. Once again, I was mistaken, because even after the end of the Soviet Union, the United States now viewed Russia as an enemy rather than taking the chance for peace with Russia. This was a grave mistake. This has led me to believe for more than 30 years that the United States does not have a sophisticated foreign policy. It understands the military approach, but it is a failure at the diplomatic approach. At the end of 1991, the United States saw the chance not only to now dominate the former Soviet Union, but even to break apart Russia. So there were ideas in the US government that just as the Soviet Union had divided along ethnic lines, now Russia too would break apart because according to the US view, Russia was too large and it should be divided between a European part, a Central Asian part, and a Far Eastern part, and that Russia could be pushed to fall apart. That became the US plan. Rather than cooperating with Russia, the idea was to weaken Russia. Now, just to say, in 1990, when this transformation was taking place, Germany reunited. And for Germany to reunite, that required an agreement among the occupying powers of Germany, because technically speaking, Germany was an occupied country all the way until 1990, after World War II. And the occupying powers were the UK, France, the United States, and Soviet Union. So there needed to be a treaty of the four occupying powers to allow East and West Germany to unite. The Germans, of course, were very keen to unite. So they told President Gorbachev, if we unite, NATO will not take advantage. NATO will not move eastward. And this was very explicitly repeated to Gorbachev on many occasions. And there is much archival documentary proof of that. This is denied by the United States now, but the United States government lies repeatedly. They told Gorbachev no eastward expansion of NATO, specifically on the 7th of February, 1990. So did the German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher say exactly the same thing to Gorbachev. But the United States and Germany lied afterwards, and they began NATO enlargement after 1991. Now, this is very important to understand. After 1991, the United States did not see the end of the Cold War as a triumph of peace, as an achievement of Gorbachev. The United States saw the end of the Cold War as a victory over the Soviet Union. So rather than declaring this a mutual win of the peoples of the United States and the former Soviet Union, the United States declared it a victory, saying that the Soviet Union lost and the United States won, and now the United States was the world's sole superpower and it could do what it wants to do. I believe that the period after 1991 was the greatest period of arrogance of American foreign policy in our history. Because after 1991, the United States' attitude was the United States is the all-powerful country. There are no rivals. Russia is a third-rate country. China is a poor, rice-growing country. There was simply the idea that the United States was dominant. Remember, too, in that period, the United States took steps to actually hold back the Japanese economy as well. Because in the 1980s, there was the idea that Japan could overtake the United States in manufacturing. And the United States took very specific measures on the currency and on export controls and on other measures to prevent Japan's continued rapid progress. So the early 1990s not only saw the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of American arrogance, but also a deep crisis in Japan, the bursting of the financial bubble, so-called. But that wasn't really a bubble. The finance in Japan was based on the idea of continued rapid growth of the Japanese economy. But the United States put an end to that growth because it regarded Japanese automotive production, semiconductor production, and other industrial advances to be dangerous to the United States. By the mid-1990s, the United States was very satisfied with foreign policy. Everything was working. There was one superpower. Everything else was under control. China was regarded as a marginal economy. Russia was regarded as a third-rate power. Japan was regarded as a loyal subsidiary and not a threat to the United States. So the United States was dominant in all dimensions, so the United States felt. And the United States began on that basis to expand its military role around the world. This is very odd. There was no threat anymore, but the United States expanded the military reach. It didn't reduce the military reach. Why is that? Because the goal was not peace. The goal was dominance. And so just as peace had come, NATO began to expand eastward from Germany. In 1999, NATO expanded to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, NATO expanded to 7 more countries: Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2008, a decisive event occurred. At the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, the United States declared that NATO would move to Ukraine and to the country of Georgia in the Caucasus region. Now, this was a direct provocation to Russia, because this would mean the presence of the U.S. military on Russia's borders, both in Russia's western border, which is 2,100 kilometers long with Ukraine, and in Russia's southern border in the Caucasus region, which is a very unstable region of high vulnerability to Russia. And the United States said it would move NATO there. There was no defense reason to move NATO to Georgia, just the opposite. But the United States persevered despite Russian very, very strong objections, saying that the United States was provocative, that it was cheating on promises, threatening war, and so on. And do understand that in that context, the United States had also destabilized the nuclear arrangements, because in 2002, the United States had left the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally. And that meant that from Russia's point of view, the nuclear arms framework had been compromised, NATO was expanding, and the United States was directly threatening Russia. And I can tell you, the U.S. foreign policy aimed to destabilize Russia. So Russia was not being paranoid. Russia was being realistic in understanding that the United States was trying to break Russia apart. This is not a good idea with a nuclear superpower, but this is the American arrogance. Well, President Putin said, no, do not come to our borders with your military. The United States regarded Putin's statements as empty because, after all, Putin represented a third-rate power and the United States was the sole superpower. And so the United States did not take seriously Russia's objections. But what happened in Ukraine was, well, what happened in Georgia, first of all, in 2008, after the NATO summit, was that the Georgian president, who was a very unstable and inexperienced person, launched a war against a breakaway region of Georgia, and Russia intervened and defeated Georgia. That was the end of Georgia's possibility of joining NATO. But Georgia had started that war actually in 2008. At the same time in Ukraine, the Ukrainian people elected a neutral government, President Viktor Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian president who did not want Ukraine to join NATO, because Mr. Yanukovych looked at a map and said, if we join NATO, we are going to get into trouble because Russia will oppose that, and this could lead to conflict with Russia. So Mr. Yanukovych was very realistic. The Ukrainian people also did not want to join NATO, according to the opinion surveys. But the United States did not want to be stopped. So the United States worked together with the anti-Russian forces of Western Ukraine to try to destabilize Yanukovych's government. And at the end of 2013, the United States helped to fund major protests against the Yanukovych government when the Yanukovych government attempted to delay signing an agreement with the European Union over membership eventually and over trade, because there were many outstanding issues. Ukraine wanted to slow down to negotiate this arrangement with Russia as well as with European Union. And the United States used its usual influences in the media, in the NGOs, in the political opposition to try to destabilize the Ukrainian government. This is a typical U.S. operation. The U.S. has destabilized dozens of governments around the world. It has intervened deeply in Japanese politics. It's intervened deeply in politics in almost every country. And it intervened in Ukraine at the end of 2013 and early 2014. In February, the United States acted behind the scenes, but with a lot of money and a lot of political power, to overthrow the government of Yanukovych. From Russia's point of view, this was a U.S.-led coup. I think this is an accurate description of what happened. Of course, the U.S. government denies this. But remember, if you are engaged in covert regime change, you deny the obvious. I happen to know a lot about these events. I saw some of it in person. The United States conspired to overthrow the government of Viktor Yanukovych. That's when the war in Ukraine began. So we should understand the war in Ukraine as starting in February 2014. And it resulted at the deepest level from the U.S. push of NATO enlargement. And it was exacerbated by the U.S. coup, or the U.S.-led coup, or the U.S.-supported coup in February 2014. The U.S. says that the war in Ukraine was caused by President Putin. This is false. The war in Ukraine was caused by the United States because it could not accept a neutral Ukraine. Or let me put it differently, it didn't want to accept a neutral Ukraine. It thought that the United States is so powerful that it can bring Ukraine into the U.S. orbit and that Russia could do nothing about it. Incidentally, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the U.S. military and security strategist of the 1980s and early 2000s, wrote a book in 1997 describing the U.S. strategy of NATO enlargement. And he argues at length in 1997 that Russia could not resist the U.S. expansionism. And that's the basis on which the U.S. proceeded, thinking it would simply be able to determine the outcome. But of course, this was arrogant, not realistic. After the coup, two provinces of ethnic Russians broke away from the regime, the new regime. These are the eastern provinces of Lugansk and Donetsk, the so-called Donbas region. They declared independence because they opposed the new regime, which was anti-Russian. And Russia negotiated a treaty with Ukraine and with these breakaway regions called the Minsk II Agreement, which was supported in the UN Security Council. And it said that the ethnic Russian regions would gain political autonomy, not separation from Ukraine, but autonomy. Now, this was backed by the UN Security Council, but the United States and Ukraine decided not to implement this agreement. They said that the U.S. said to the Ukrainian government, there is no reason for you to follow this agreement, even though it is the international law. Just ignore it. And so instead, the U.S. built up the Ukrainian army between 2015 and 2021 to an army of 900,000 people, the largest army in Europe at the time. And Russia watched all of this with growing alarm. At the end of 2021, President Putin urged President Biden to stop NATO enlargement. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement between Russia and the United States based on the end of NATO enlargement. President Biden refused to negotiate with President Putin on this. And that was the last chance to avoid the escalation, which began in February 2022. I hope you can see, ladies and gentlemen, by this narrative that the story that this was an unprovoked war by Putin starting in 2022 is simply a lie. This is a story that goes back to the early 1990s, and it is based on U.S. expansionism, not Russian expansionism. But this is the kind of propaganda that we have in the Western media and in the U.S. government narrative. So that's how the war started. Now, what was the purpose of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022? Was it to conquer Ukraine? No. It was only 50 to 100,000 troops. It was not to conquer Ukraine. The goal was to force Ukraine to accept neutrality. And within about a month of the so-called special military operation, President Zelensky said that Ukraine would accept neutrality. And on that basis, there were negotiations in Istanbul in March and April 2022 to end the war. And they were reaching a success. But then in April 2022, when the two sides had neared an agreement, the United States and the United Kingdom told President Zelensky, do not sign that agreement. You should fight on. You should continue your war against Russia because our aim is to weaken Russia, and you don't have to accept neutrality. And so the United States condemned Ukraine to 3 more years of war, during which time Ukraine has lost more than 1 million young people to death or to grave injury on the battlefield. Of course, the United States does not tell the truth about anything that I've just said. It says that this is all President Putin's fault. But this is a standard approach of the U.S. government. And many, many people now understand the true story. The goal all along has been U.S. domination, and Russia has resisted. Now, just to bring us up to the present, the aim of President Putin has been to get the United States and Ukraine to accept neutrality rather than NATO. President Trump now accepts this reality. But ironically, Zelensky, who rules by martial law and by personal decree, and his European backers, especially the British, the French, and the Germans, do not accept neutrality. This is why the war continues. The Europeans are very cynical. They are content for the war to continue as long as it is Ukrainians who are doing the dying. And Ukraine is being destroyed step by step at the hands of its supposed friends, because the Europeans want to keep Russia weakened, and they want Ukrainians to die for that purpose. They don't want them to die, but they're content for the Ukrainians to die for that purpose. What they are not willing to do is engage in honest diplomacy with Russia, which is how this war should be ended. Let me stop there on Ukraine and turn to Gaza.